Hello and welcome to another of our stories from Earby Tales from the North. Just like to thank people for the support they've been given to All Saints Church, particularly during the last couple of years have been very difficult. I know there's been some problems with the Just Giving page, but I'd like to thank everybody that's been putting money in the collection boxes in the shops, the cafes and various other businesses in Earby during this time. And if you were intending to help out the church as a result of these stories and have had problems with the Just Giving page, if you're local to Earby and area, you'll probably find a red collection box in most of the shops and businesses in the main street and in the Earby area. So thank you again for all your support. We'll just begin our new story in a moment. Hello. Our story today is called Freya and the Giant Wyrm. Where the Atlantic Ocean hits the far north of Scotland, the cliffs, the mountains and the sea were home to a group of North people. They'd come there 2 generations before the time our story takes place. They'd landed in their longships and their cargo ships, looking for a place to stay, looking for a place to live, and there they found it. Great fishing, seabirds' eggs, pasture for their sheep, wood in the forests on the side of the mountains, and land for crops, because that was important. Growing crops, it made settlement permanent. They'd begun to build next to the ruins of a stone tower, and what was left of the ruins of a broken down stone wall. And that really made them wonder why that was there. Because the stone tower, a broch built by the Picts, in that time all the other stone towers, all the other brochs were inhabited. In fact, some traded with the North people, some fought with the North people, but they'd never seen one broken down like this. But they started to build a longhouse and the other settlement houses next to the broken down rock and its walls. And all would have been well. Cutting down the wood, bringing it down to build a longhouse, all would have been well until the morning after the first full moon they'd been there. The morning came misty. The sea was still. You could hear it murmuring against the coast, not wildly raging. Still, misty morning, when suddenly something appeared, or rather the sound of something coming closer was heard. Whatever it was would have been very large indeed. Some of the men and women were out collecting wood, looking after the sheep that they brought with them, when suddenly out of the mist came the most incredibly frightening sight. It was the giant worm. We probably would have called it a dragon. Not with wings, but one of these dragons that you see in some stories that look like a large snake with legs and a long snout and huge teeth. It wasn't breathing fire, but in the cold morning, the air from its nostrils looked as if it was. For a moment, the giant worm looked at the people, and the people looked at the giant worm. And then 2 things happened. With a lunge, the worm reached forward and grabbed hold of and ate in front of everybody else one of the men that was standing there. With a scream and a yell, everybody else ran and ran and ran. They ran to the ruins of the broch and its wall, and they got as many people inside as they could. Not everybody could get inside. The worm went round and round the outside, eating everything it could. So by the time our story takes place, a couple of generations later, the North people had made a change. They'd rebuilt the tower, they'd rebuilt the wall, in fact made it even higher, and the longhouse and all the other houses of the settlement were cramped inside. One large, thick wooden gate guarded that fortification. And they knew that on the night of a full moon they had to get everybody inside, all the animals inside, and hope against hope that the giant worm, the great worm from the mountains, didn't get in. Of course, not everybody could get in. Of course, not all the animals could get in, and so people used to try and get away down on the coast or further away in the boats, anywhere to get away from the giant worm. Which meant, of course, that the settlement wasn't as wonderful as their ancestors had thought. In fact, they grew very little crops at all. The people asked Ragnar the Skald what to do about it. Had he heard of any times in history, in all the poems and the sagas of the people of the North, how to deal with this great worm? Now Ragnar, the Skald, he knew all the histories of the peoples of the North. He also used to write poetry and write stories down himself. In fact, that was his job. He was a very important person, and a person that everybody turned to, but even he did not know what to do. Oh, there were plenty of legends, but they were legends about fearless warriors who dug holes, and when the great worms, dragons, or whatever they liked to call them in those days, climbed over the top of the hole, going somewhere else, the great hero would stab up with a sword or a spear into the soft underbelly and kill them. Trouble was, nobody wanted to risk that. Rumour was that once somebody had tried that in that very place. They never even found his body. Of course, that could have been a rumour. So they were still having to hide inside the fortification, inside the longhouse inside the fortification, or be out at sea, or run away as far as they could. It was getting towards the time of the new moon, and people were beginning to feel nervous. But it was also a great celebration, because the leader of that particular community had got to a certain age. And when he was at that certain age, he decided he was going to have a feast. It was a wonderful feast. The fish, the sheep, everything, the wine which they got by trading, the beer which they made locally. It was a fantastic feast, and everybody was so full and tired that they were falling to sleep even before the feast had ended. Now, as they were falling to sleep, Ragnar's daughter Freya decided that, she'd get some of tomorrow's jobs done. Now Freya, young woman, was an excellent cook, and she decided that what she was going to do was make her famous seafood broth. Now it was a combination of fish, of shellfish, which she collected from a little island off the coast, which had actually joined to the coast by very, very jagged rocks when the tide was out. She also, from that very island, collected some herbs that she didn't know the name of, but Oh, they made that broth so absolutely appetizing that nobody could resist it. In fact, when she used to make it, oh, the smell used to bring people into the longhouse to see when would it be ready. So there she was, in the corner of the longhouse, by the fire, cooking her broth, adding the herbs, adding the shellfish, stirring away, when suddenly she realised somebody was coming towards her. She turned round. It was one of the old men. He looked tired, but he said, "Oh, I have eaten so much, Freya Ragnarsdottir. I have eaten so much, but the smell, the smell of that broth you make, oh, I could walk miles for that, even though I'm full." And with that, he laughed, smelled the broth and said, "And will it be ready for the morning?" "Oh, yes," said Freya. "That's why I started it tonight. It will be ready for you in the morning." As he walked away to go back to his seat, Freya watched him, and an idea came into her head. "I wonder," she thought, "I wonder." It was the evening before the night of the full moon, and Freya, because it was high tide, went down to the shore. She had a large cooking pot. She had logs, small logs for a fire. She had all the ingredients she needed for this broth. And she got into a boat and paddled out to the island off the coast. She took everything out of the boat, carried it up the steep, twisty path to the top of the island. From there, if you looked carefully, you could see the broch, you could see the walls, you could just about see the top of the longhouse, with the smoke still rising in the air from the fires that were dying out. She hadn't told anybody what she was going to do. She built a fire ready to light. She put the pot filled with water on the top of the fire. She put all the ingredients into the pot and sat and waited and waited and waited and waited, and suddenly woke up. The sun was beginning to rise behind the longhouse, behind the settlement. She could just about see the trees on the side of the mountains. It was the morning after the new moon, and Freya had to get ready. Banging stones together, she formed a spark, and the spark lit the kindling, and the fire started to burn. The sun came over the horizon, and Freya was stirring the pot. The smell of the herbs and the shellfish and the fish was starting to rise up into the morning air. She stirred and stirred and stirred and put more ingredients in. She put more logs on the fire. The broth was bubbling and bubbling and bubbling. And because it was still morning, the smell was round where she was, and the heat went up into the air rather than blowing out to sea or over the land. And then she saw it, slithering down through the trees came the Great Wyrm. Now she'd never seen it before, but she was terrified. The Great Wyrm was covered in grey scales, but below its neck and down onto its belly she could see the green of its skin. She looked over the edge of the island. Would her plan work? The tide was out. Would her plan work? She stirred and stirred and stirred. She stirred so much and disturbed the broth that the smell kept rising. The great worm came down towards the fortification, towards the longhouse, towards the stone tower, and suddenly stopped. For a moment, Freya thought, "What's it thinking?" But then it raised its head, and even at that distance, Freya could see it going. And then it looked straight at her. For a moment, she was terrified. Would her plan work? She stirred the pot even more, and the smell just rose in the morning air. The great worm went past the walls to the edge of the cliff and looked across at the island. Except, of course, with the tide being out, it wasn't an island. No, there was a bridge of incredibly sharp rocks between the shore at the bottom of the cliff and where Freya was, where the smell was coming from. The great worm slithered over the top of the cliff and landed on the beach. It started to walk slowly towards the rocks. It was so interested in the smell that was coming from Freya's cooking pot that it didn't notice how sharp those rocks were. It pulled itself with its little short legs across, away from the beach. The smell was so great, it actually ignored the fact that there was pain in its belly where it was going over the rocks. It came closer and closer and closer to where Freya was stirring broth. By now her eyes were huge, and she was looking not straight ahead, but up at the head, which was coming closer and closer to her. But it was also going slower, because the great worm was so greedy that it didn't realise that the sharp rocks were actually cut into it, like spears, like swords. It was as if suddenly 100 warriors attacked it at the same time. The great worm stopped. It was in agony. It was absolutely in agony, and it roared and roared, and it tried to turn round. But as soon as it turned round, the sharp rocks cut into it even more. So it turned back to where the beautiful smell was coming from, and the sharp rocks cut into it even more. It roared and roared and roared, and it went weaker and weaker and weaker. And finally, the great worm's head fell onto the rocks, and its eyes closed, and it breathed its last breath. Freya stopped stirring. She walked to the edge of the island and looked at the great worm's head. Was its eyes going to open? Was its mouth going to open? Was it going to suddenly spring up and eat her? No. Oh no. The great worm was dead. By now, of course, the people in the settlement had been raised up by the watchmen who'd been on the tower and had seen all this happening and couldn't quite believe what they saw. They came rushing down to the edge of the cliff, and they were shouting and dancing and yelling and waving and calling for Freya to come back home. She went down to the boat, leaving the broth where it was, and rowed back to the shore. The people picked her up and carried her back to the longhouse, cheering and shouting, trying to make up songs. When they got to the longhouse, her father, Ragnar the Skald, was standing at the door with his arms folded, with a look on his face. And she was worried that he was cross, but suddenly he smiled. He laughed. People stopped singing and dancing and cheering and put Freya down. Freya walked up to her father, and her mother was there, and the rest of her brothers and sisters. They all gave her an enormous hug. And her father looked at her. What a wonderful thing to happen, he said. Well, she said, and started to tell him what she thought about and how it had all come about. Stop, he said, stop. You know my job, don't you? I hold the history of our people going right back, and I write poems and stories for the people now. But there has never, ever been a time where I could write a story or a poem about a hero. And now I can. Freya looked at him. What do you mean? Well, he said, I've started writing it in my head already. Started writing what? Said Freya. The saga, said her father. What saga? Said Freya. The saga of Freya Dragonsbane. Freya the Dragon Killer. And that's the end of our story for this time.